Hello and welcome back to Voices of the West. Today we have a special treat for everyone. Today we are talking to Patrick Dearen, who is a Texas Literary Hall of Famer and author of 26 books, both fiction and nonfiction. And boy, you've won almost every major award it seems that exists out there. You've got a spur, you've got numerous medallions, all kinds of good things. But thank you for joining us today, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Kevin.
Very good. Well, tell us all a little bit about yourself. You've got quite the reputation that's already built up for you, but tell us a little bit about how you first got started, particularly into Westerns.
Well, I always loved to read. And when I was 10 years old, my mother gave me Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. He also wrote Westerns.
Yes.
And it was a magic moment from then on. And then when I was 14, growing up in a small West Texas town, Sterling City, population at the time about 700, my freshman high school English teacher made the mistake of suggesting I consider writing as a career. He did not know that at that moment he had created a monster. I went home that very afternoon, age 14, began writing my first novel. And it has been my passion ever since. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. They had no major in creative writing, so I majored in journalism, but I took all their creative writing courses, including the most beneficial was a conference course in creative writing that you could repeat for credit. I took it 4 times because that was my college. And worked with the newspapers, a couple of different newspapers here in West Texas, but I was always working on a novel in my spare time. And in terms of Westerns, I always had a great interest in regional history here in West Texas. And I would go arrowhead hunting as a kid. I would look around an old U.S. Army sub post, collect artifacts. So I guess it was a natural progression eventually on into Westerns.
What is it about the Western that really appeals to you, both as a writer and reader?
Well, I guess I need to go back a little bit farther into my nonfiction work because I really cannot overstress the importance of nonfiction in my novels. I've written 10 nonfiction books, including documented history books about West Texas for university presses, folklore works, journalism works, and that has given me the necessary background for my novels. One of the things that I did was interview 76 men who cowboyed in the region before 1932.
Ah.
And before the 1930s, cowboying was the same as it was basically since the 1870s, 1880s. There were still trail drives. They just didn't go 300 miles or 6 months. They went 10 miles or 20 miles to the railroad. And so I learned so much about old cowboy life that it intrigued me so much, and the history of our area here in West Texas, cowboy place. Texas is known for its cowboy history. That it was just natural for me to begin writing Western novels.
Very good. What do you think makes a good Western novel?
I think you need a basis in history. I know that I do, because I do a tremendous amount of research for each of my Western novels. Because if it doesn't seem real to me, I cannot make it seem real to the reader. So I think you need a basis in history. And yes, it's fiction, but I take my characters and I throw them against historical events. If not historical events, then folklorish events, things that I've researched over the time. And there's just so much here in West Texas that's happened over the last 150, 170 years, that it's really been a wealth of information that I've had to work with.
Yes, indeed. What would you feel is the most underexposed and underdeveloped part of the Old West in terms of, that you get all kinds of books out there that's, Texas Rangers, go hunt down the bad guys, bounty hunters going out hunting for banditos, different things like that are the typical thing. I notice a lot of your books are, I would put them seem to take place in the latter end of the Western era. And you're looking a lot at reactions to how somebody that was raised in the area adjusts to a changing world around them. What do you think that really it could be delved into as new storylines and new characters, something that what would interest you, or where haven't you gone yet?
Although I have historical accuracy in the background, novels are about characters. They're about people, because we are readers and we are individuals, and we need to identify with the people in the stories. And so I have indeed taken a look at the transition period from the Old West to the more modern West. In fact, one of my personal favorite Western novel actually takes place contemporary, at least contemporary to the time that I wrote it, which would have been in the 1990s. When I was a reporter for the San Angelo, Texas Standard Times as a very young reporter, early 20s, I went out and covered a manhunt here in West Texas in rugged ranch land. And a man who had told family and friends that he was born out of time, that he should have lived 100 years before, 120 years before, that he should have lived in the Old West. Well, one day he walks up to a remote line shack on the edge of wilderness canyons, and he takes a horse and saddle and literally rides off into the sunset, sparking a 4-day manhunt. Well, I covered that as a young reporter, and from my first moment at the scene of the manhunt, I knew that someday I would write a novel about the event. That novel became When Cowboys Die, which was had the good fortune to see it be a finalist for the Spur Award when it was first published, and it was just reissued last summer by TCU Press. So we have the story of a man enthralled with the Old West, as I am, who goes chasing after it, goes chasing after the lost Old West in the wilderness. And that's the kind of thing that I really do every time I sit down and write. I chase the lost Old West.
Very much, yes. Speaking of which, how do you feel the Western market is changing these days? It's traditionally, you always think of the 1950s and such like that as the heyday of the Western, but I mean, it stretches far beyond that, and the appeal continues to grow. But how do you feel the market is changing now?
Well, I have belonged to Western Writers of America since 1990. And so that's 33 years. And from my first time in the organization, I kept hearing the Western is dead, the Western is dead. Well, it's been through some tough times, but we're still around. The West is still around because it's a frame of mind that will never go away as long as we find new ways to approach it as writers, rather than rehashing, let's say, the works of Zane Grey, a writer I greatly admire. I look for things that have never been written about before, or at least approach them in a way that no other writer has done so before. And so hopefully it will give the reader a fresh look at things. And here in the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, I have written a couple of novels set in during the Mexican Revolution, which took place between beginning about 1910, and which greatly impacted extreme West Texas. There were multiple raids across the river, things that engaged Texas Rangers and the U.S. military. But it was such a remote area, it was all still done on horseback. And so although the year may have been 1917, 1918, as in two of my recent novels, it was still very much the Old West. And so it's opened up a new area for me to write about.
Excellent. And speaking of that, what kind of Western have you long dreamed of writing
Oh, wow.
about? Something you haven't quite gotten to, but it's still milling around and you really want to get to that.
Well, I would say I have just finished writing it. In 2014, I did a novel called The Big Drift. And it's about the great cattle drift, the great cattle migration of 1884, 1885, in which hundreds of thousands of cattle, open range cattle, flooded Texas during a blizzard. And in those days, there were fences, but there were only drift fences every 40 or 50 miles, perhaps. Well, this blizzard was so intense that the cattle would push up against it. They would die, and the succeeding animals would actually bridge the fences by climbing over the carcasses and jumping off. Wow. One cowboy said, like turtles jumping off a log. And so I based a novel against that historical background. But I also chose as my characters a black cowboy and a white cowboy. So thus I was able to explore race relations on the range in 1880s Texas. And I had the good fortune of getting the Spur Award in 2015 for The Big Drift. And let's see here. Well, can you see that?
It is, yes.
The Big Drift. And so I said I got the Spur Award in 2015 and had a lot of reader reaction. Most notably, I guess, because I left a number of open ends. Because to me, the main story was the inner story. And that's often the case with me. It's what's going on inside my characters as opposed to what's going on outside. But I had so many requests for a sequel that just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I wrapped up the sequel. And so that's the one that's been lingering now for, 10 years, basically. Mm-hmm. And hopefully it'll find a home at a publisher in the next 18 months or so. We'll see.
It's got good legs to stand on from the previous one, definitely.
The most difficult thing for me to do is create characters. And so it was fun to pull my characters out of my past and insert them into my current work. That's also kind of difficult because you haven't been inside the minds of those characters in so long. Can you recapture that? Remains to be seen. Hopefully I have.
For someone that's new to you, to your books, what would you suggest to be the first one that they read? You had The Big Drift there, it definitely has lots of accolades to it, but what's your favorite that you would want people to start reading your work with?
Well, I would have said The Big Drift, but because we already mentioned that, perhaps we'll talk about one called The End of Nowhere. This came out, about 18 months ago, The End of Nowhere. And it's highly autobiographical. When I was a young reporter, early 20s, I was always wanting to be a novelist. That was my main interest. But the newspapers did help me to not only learn the craft of writing, because if you put words together and you try to improve, you will improve. But it also gave me ideas, such as the When Cowboys Die that I mentioned. But I would get disillusioned, young and disillusioned, and I would say, I'm going to hop a freight train to Mexico and I'm going to live in a Mexican village. Well, I actually went out twice to hop a freight train to Mexico, but I had the schedule wrong and a train never showed up, or I probably wouldn't be here today. But what I did was I actually began a novel. If you can't live it, then write it. Okay. And so I actually wrote the opening 3,500 words, I guess, back in my early 20s. And as I was looking for I put it away for 47 years. And I came across the manuscript, and I was discussing it with my wife, who is she was a 40-year newspaper veteran, and 10 years as managing editor of a newspaper, and my personal editor. And so I bounced things off of her a lot. She encouraged me to write the novel. And so I took the basic idea, the opening of it, and I threw it against an event in history that occurred at a small Mexican village called Porvenir, right on the bank of the Rio Grande, from Mexico. And in 1917, there was it was 1918 actually, Texas Rangers historically invaded the town on horseback. They believed the town to be a haven for outlaws, for bandits, and believed that they had been responsible for a recent raid on a ranch. And so in the middle of the night, they took everybody out of the town, meaning they took out of their homes. They selected 15 men, ranging in age, males from 15 to 72, took them out, shot them, executed them without authorization, known as the Porvenir Massacre. And no one was ever indicted for that. And so I throw my fictional self into that Mexican village and let my character experience what's going on. So that's The End of Nowhere. And I guess because it's so biographical, it's sort of a special one to me.
Absolutely. That would definitely be an interesting thing to see yourself having to go into, because yeah, you have the fantasy of hitting the road and traveling around, and yeah, that kind of turns it all on its ear, and you have to basically survive through something rather horrific and all that.
Yes, and the real challenge was how to take this horrific event and have a novel come across as positive as opposed to a downer. So as a writer, that was a challenge, but readers have told me that apparently I was able to succeed in that effort, perhaps.